Thank you for joining us today for Kroc Border Behind the Headlines. This is a new periodic event series at the Kroc School that we will use to dig into the nuances of border issues in the news. Today's discussion is moderated by Ev Mead, Professor of Practice at the Kroc School, with leaders from organizations working in San Diego and Tijuana to support asylum seekers at the border right now. After we hear from our speakers, we will have an opportunity for discussion with the audience. So please feel free to include any questions that you have at any time in the YouTube live chat. Ev, thank you so much for organizing today's discussion. I'll give the floor to you to begin.
Let me say that again with the microphone on. Thank you very much, Melissa, and welcome everyone. This is a really urgent situation that we're dealing with on the border right now, and I'm so glad to have a group of really credible, incredibly dedicated leaders in this field to talk with us today, and also to identify some opportunities for how you can get involved if you want to make a difference here on the border. I want to say a couple things about what's happening right now and why we're doing this. And I'm going to focus a little bit on the macro, or what's going on nationally in the US and Mexico, because my panelists are much better able to talk about what's going on right here in Tijuana, San Diego. So what's going on? Well, even to talk about it nationally, you have to start right here in San Diego. Many of you may have seen the news from Sunday morning, about 10 o'clock in the morning. A 40-foot motor cruiser busted up on the rocks right here off of Point Loma. If you were anywhere near the coast, you saw the helicopters, boats, jet skis, even a Navy officer on a paddleboard trying to help rescue people. 4 people died. There were more than 30 people in the hold. 24 people were hospitalized. And this was at 10 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't in the wee hours of the night. It wasn't on a desolate beach somewhere. It was right here in our national monument, right off downtown San Diego, Point Loma. That desperation right now is the situation, not just here in San Diego, but up and down the border. We don't have the total metadata to show this yet, but this year, the fiscal year 2021, which began in October, will almost certainly be the most lethal year in the recent history of the border. People are dying crossing our border and taking incredibly desperate measures to try to get here. And I think we can't forget about this in talking about policy or getting lost in the politics of it. We just have to, I want to underscore the urgency of this situation. That's not just in San Diego. And if you look at the border, we've had more than 12,000 people have died since 1998. We know this. We talk about it in a particular way. We have images that come to mind. But one of the things that we've seen this year that I think is more striking is how many children we've seen dying on the border, and really people in situations of extreme vulnerability dying on the border. And it's not one. It's not like last summer when we had a 9-year-old girl and her father from El Salvador who drowned in the border, and it was global news. The picture was everywhere, front page of the New York Times. There have been so many this year that none of them have received much attention. Just go back to March. A 9-year-old girl from Mexico died in the river. A month before, an 8-year-old boy from Guatemala. We've had a 6-month-old infant thrown in the river by a coyote that was rescued by a Border Patrol agent. We've had 2 toddlers from Ecuador tossed over a 14-foot wall. This is a really urgent and desperate situation. So I want to underscore that, and if I'm striking kind of a grave tone, it's because it's a pretty grave situation. And again, it's not limited to one maritime tragedy here in San Diego. It's happening up and down the border. Let me just say one thing about 2 quick things about the numbers, just to add a little context to what we're talking about. So if you pay attention right now to these tragedies, you could come away with the impression that all of a sudden there are more people than ever trying to cross the border. And it's sort of true and not true. It's true that the number of apprehensions so far in the fiscal year are very high. It's more than 500,000, which would put us on track for more than 1 million people apprehended, which would be high. There's no doubt about that. But what I want to say would be about where it was in 2019, for example. But what I would say is when we look at these surges in people crossing the border, if you look historically, they don't tend to last very long. as desperate as they feel, as many people as we see waiting to come in, the recent history tells us that these will only last a few months. And it's important to say that not because I want to be proved right or wrong, but just to say that there's a tendency to view these things as some kind of overwhelming wave that everybody in the world is trying to get into the United States. It's just not true. These are very particular populations from a very small number of countries in a very specific situation. And I'd be happy, anybody who wants a fact sheet, I'd be happy to share some data about that to support that assertion. The last thing I want to say is that this is a different group of people than we've had on the border in a long time. It's a much more vulnerable group of people. One of the things that happened in really beginning in 2019 is that the apprehensions on the border went way up, but there were two key differences. The first key difference is that, different from the pattern of the last 50 years on the US-Mexico border, most of the people apprehended were family units and children, not single adults. That was a real change. It's just a different, it's a whole different from a humanitarian perspective and a human rights perspective. It's just a different group of people. And the second thing I would say about that is all those little numbers, all the individual human stories behind the data on apprehensions, they mean something different. If you go back and you look at the US-Mexico border in 2000, when we had in the year 2000, we had over 1 million apprehensions. Almost all those people were trying to abscond. They were trying to get in the United States without getting caught. And many of them had a lot of experience going back and forth. It's the same people count multiple times because they're apprehended multiple times. It's mostly single men and mostly going to work. That is not what's happening on the border right now. It's mostly not single men, and many of them are crossing for the first time. And that makes them much more vulnerable to much more exploitative networks of coyotes, fraudsters, organized crime, a whole bunch of people who would take advantage of them. And the other thing is they're trying to get caught by and large. Not everybody, but still a lot of these folks are trying to get to the other side and put their hands up so that they can make a claim for asylum. And that's really different. So in other words, you can say, well, apprehensions are way up and they're more or less the same they were, in 2019 or back in 2007, but it's a fundamentally different population and they're trying to get caught because they have a claim to make. And I think we haven't really adjusted at a policy level to that reality, to the needs of a vulnerable population, to the degree to which they can be exploited, and to the fact that they're actually asking for help more than anything else. So I wanted to set that out there as some context, and I'll turn it over to my panelists now. I'm just going to introduce them as a group so that we can go one by one through them. Again, I'm really honored to have you guys here. I know how busy you are right now, and I really appreciate your time. Our first panelist today is Nicole Ramos, who's the director of the Border Rights Project, El Otro Lado. Those of you who don't know El Otro Lado, these are U.S. immigration lawyers who are based in Tijuana. It's an amazing organization. It started off with an extreme amount of effort on behalf of some really dedicated attorneys. It was an organization that at its founding was sort of designed to deal with people who had been deported and other people who had legal cases in the United States but were in Mexico. But in response to this particular population, starting with the caravans, really became a frontline provider for asylum seekers in particular. This is a group that's also, they're courageous in many ways, but I would just signal out that their treatment by the US government, they've been, put on blacklists, they've been targeted and harassed, and it's really important to recognize the courage that they've shown in the face of that. They also deal with people's human needs, not just human rights. They have a whole division providing humanitarian assistance to the clients they serve. So really glad to have Nicole here. Our second panelist is Matthew Cannon, who runs the children's program at Casa Cornelia Law Center. They're the biggest provider of legal service to unaccompanied minors here in San Diego. The unaccompanied minor population, we're back to where we were in 2014, where we have a large number, nearly 50,000 already this year. Being a lawyer and representing these people, as Matt can tell you, is just a really fundamentally different it's a whole different undertaking than representing adults. The level of distrust that children have in adults, the degree to which they don't, see a difference between the lawyer representing them and somebody with the government, the trauma that they have and being separated from their parents and going through this horror show that is the border right now. It just demands a whole different touch and a whole different kind of client representation. And Matt's an expert and someone who's really dedicated a big chunk of his life to that. And I'm thrilled to have you here, Matt. Our next presenter will be Dulce Garcia, who's done a lot of stuff with us at the Kroc School and always been very generous with her time. Dulce is the executive director of Border Angels. Dulce has a career before that. She's one of our pioneering undocumented immigration lawyers here in California, who's been an inspiration to dreamers and documented folks all over the United States. As executive director of Border Angels, I think she's taken that organization in some new directions that have been really good for our community and for the quality of human rights in our community. She's gotten them involved in direct legal advocacy, particularly when it comes to raising money and doing the legal advocacy behind getting people bonded out so they didn't have to be in a detention center during a pandemic. They've done really heroic and amazing work there. And then they've also been really good at raising awareness in the United States and raising money, and then giving that money to humanitarian organizations on the other side of the border so that it gets spent right. And they've supported all kinds of shelters and humanitarian efforts in Tijuana and really deserve praise for that. It's a best practice in peace building, by the way. Get to the source, get to the grassroots organizations. They know best where aid should go, and Border Angels is a model there. Finally, I have my colleague from the University of San Diego, Maria Silva, the Director of Community Partnerships at the Mulvaney Center. Maria's an absolute leader in the humanitarian field there. She's part of she's gotten USD sort of a really good spot at the front of the California Welcoming Task Force. They've specialized in basically what I would say is treating asylum seekers the way we treat refugees. You know, we have a lot of infrastructure for people who are welcomed in the refugee program. And I think a lot of people don't understand that asylum seekers aren't entitled to any of that. And they've tried to fill that gap. And I think that's really important. So working with the IRC to help families seeking asylum who don't have any family in the United States and might need long-term case management. They provide all the stuff you'd expect in terms of direct assistance, but also spiritual accompaniment, mental health services. And like Dulce at Border Angels, they've done a great job at taking their assistance and putting it in the hands of grassroots providers. And they've partnered with organizations like Espacio Migrante and Alma Migrante, and they've also partnered with Al Otro Lado here. So a really terrific panel. I'm going to turn it over to you guys. We'll start with Nicole, just so the audience understands how we're going to go here. I've asked each of the panelists to talk for 7 to 10 minutes or so, talk about the work that they're doing, and then at the end we'll have a good bit of time left for your questions and comments. You can post your questions in the comment section on YouTube Live, and those will be fed back to us. And time permitting, we'll get to as many of those as we can. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Nicole Ramos from Al Otro Lado.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here today. As many people in the immigration space cheered the arrival of President Biden, advocates like myself at El Otro Lado at the US-Mexico border remained incredibly wary. Biden campaigned on the promise to end the migrant protection protocols, which is the Remain in Mexico policy that forced asylum seekers to wait for adjudication of their asylum claims in Mexican border cities. However, he made no similar promises to repeal Title 42, which is the policy that expels asylum seekers who are apprehended crossing the border back to Mexico, or in other cases, back to their home country, including countries like Haiti and Cameroon, which are in the midst of some of the worst political crises in those countries' recent history. It's been over 1 year now since the Trump administration implemented Title 42. It's been over 90 days, I think we're at 100 days since President Biden took office. And in all of that time, we are supposed to believe that things will be different and we're supposed to give his administration a chance. However, as has been previously pointed out, the border is the most violent that it has been in years, certainly the most violent that I've seen it in the 7 years that I've been in Tijuana. Right now in Tijuana, our staff and volunteers routinely receive reports from asylum seekers whose family members have been kidnapped by organized crime and held for ransom, or who have survived kidnapping themselves. Our staff regularly receives videos of asylum seekers with guns pointed at their heads, all being threatened that if their families do not pay the $5,000 or the $10,000, that they will be killed and their bodies will never be found. In Tijuana, it's not uncommon for us as lawyers and humanitarian workers to be forced in the position of running informal safe house programs, even though we are not equipped and have no such training. Moving asylum seekers around the city like chess pieces on a chessboard, away from kidnappers, away from sex traffickers, and organized crime. Sadly, this is not the first time that the US government has turned its back on refugees fleeing death. In 1939, US immigration officials prevented the landing of the MS St. Louis from docking in Florida, despite the fact that that ship was carrying over 900 Jewish refugees, many of them children, who were fleeing Nazi Germany. And many of those refugees aboard would later be murdered in the concentration camps. And they would have lived had we allowed them to make their claims for protection. That we've learned nothing from our history does not bode well for the Biden administration's future. And that Title 42 has not been repealed in all of this time that he's had in office and continues to be affirmed as a public health measure is deeply troubling. Presented to the public by the Trump administration as a necessary tool to protect the lives of US citizens during a global pandemic, Title 42 put an indefinite stop to processing of asylum seekers at the US-Mexico border. The Department of Homeland Security also stressed that it would prevent cross-border community spread between communities in the interior in the United States and the migrant population in Mexico. Outside of advocacy circles, there was very little pushback from the general public. And sadly, this is not the first time that immigrants have been portrayed as vectors of disease and illness who are coming here to do us harm. Despite the message that Title 42 is necessary to protect the health of US citizens, border authorities' application of this policy has in fact created life-threatening circumstances for some US citizens, and also laid bare the value judgments involved in how state actors decide which US citizen lives are worth protecting, particularly when those US citizens involved are infants who are born to migrant mothers. Shortly after Title 42 took effect, community-based organizations all along the southern border, including Al Otro Lado, began documenting cases of migrant mothers with US citizen newborns who had been expelled to Mexico, including mothers from Mexico, countries in Central America, and mothers from Haiti who could not even speak Spanish, but only spoke Haitian Creole. And while the push factors for these mothers to flee home are different, there's important patterns that exist across the cases. All of these mothers reported fear of persecution in their home country and threats of violence, which drove them to seek asylum at the border. All of these mothers reported significant difficulty in accessing medical care in border cities, including hospitals in which to give birth due to the pandemic, but also due to pre-existing patterns of discrimination against migrants in healthcare settings in Mexico. All of them expressed concern for their personal safety in Mexico, particularly in these northern border cities, which are world renowned for their murder rates, including Tijuana, which was last year rated the 5th most dangerous city in the world. Shortly after crossing the border, these mothers were apprehended by Border Patrol, taken to nearby hospitals in the United States because often the stress of crossing the border would push them into labor. And they soon found themselves giving birth in private hospitals contracted to serve migrants in CBP custody. Prior to the mothers being cleared for medical discharge, they were often asked for the names and contact information of family members or friends in the US that could receive them, leading them to conclude that they would be permitted to remain in the United States in order to fight their asylum claims. Once the mothers were medically cleared for discharge, however, they were soon transported by CBP and unceremoniously dumped across the border. Some of the mothers were unaware that they were even being returned to Mexico until it was too late and they saw the signs that indicated they were indeed in Mexico. Once back in Mexico, the mothers are left to fend for themselves, quite literally. Authorities make no effort to ensure there's a safety plan in place to receive these mothers and US citizen infants. In one case, one particularly egregious case, a Haitian mother who spoke only Creole, and had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, was forced to sleep a few nights in the streets near the port of entry, which is one of the most dangerous zones of the city of Tijuana, with her baby, during which time she was robbed and very nearly raped. Now, I just want you to imagine, even if you're not a parent, what that must feel like to be sleeping on a street and have all of these forces trying to take your things, trying to take your child, and you're just trying to keep that little baby alive. Another mother was expelled to Tijuana following an emergency C-section with her US citizen infant and 2 other young children who she was migrating with. And staff from another organization found her literally laying on the floor of a shelter in pain from her C-section scar and unable to care for her children. Perhaps the most shocking factor of these expulsions is that CBP removes the new mothers before they have the opportunity to secure a US birth certificate for their infants, thus leaving them undocumented in Mexico in a position of statelessness, unable to access basic protections because they cannot prove the fact of their birth. The pandemic is the perfect excuse to prevent the processing of asylum seekers. It's also the perfect opportunity to deny the birthright citizenship of US-born infants to asylum-seeking mothers. And to be clear, it represents a value judgment made by the US government as to which US citizen lives matter. And although both political parties would have us believe that they have a deep responsibility to protecting the children, US citizen children, it's really clear that the only children that they're talking about are white children. The border doesn't have to be this way, and it's our responsibility as a community to hold our government accountable. Biden doesn't get a pass because he came after Trump. DHS doesn't get a pass because it looks like we're trying and maybe we should give them a chance. Justice should not have to wait just because the people involved are migrants. We are the United States of America, one of the most powerful nations in the world, an alleged leader of the free world, an alleged champion of human rights. That's why we've gone to war so many times, to defend the rights of others. And so we owe it to the world to get it together, to make sure that our actions line up with what we say that our values are. The crime here is not migration across the border. The crime is what we, as the United States of America, are doing to immigrants. I know some of you might feel really confused about what you can do, particularly if you're not a lawyer. We have lots of volunteer opportunities at El Dorado for people of all different skill levels, all different language backgrounds, and many opportunities for people who are not lawyers. And those opportunities are both remote and in person in Tijuana for people who have been fully vaccinated. So I really encourage you to marshal your outrage and to consider contacting us about volunteering, because this problem can't be solved by lawyers, particularly in a legal system, for lack of a better word, is complete trash. It is a system that is owed no reverence because it is a system that tortures immigrants for no other reason than to get them to stop coming. And of course, we also welcome everyone's donations to support our programming, but really we're very interested in communicating and partnering up with like-minded individuals in the community, because it is going to take an entire US community to hold this government accountable. Thank you, and I will cede the floor to my other panelists.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Our next panelist is Matthew Cannon, the director of the Children's Program at Casa Cornelia Law Center. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Ev, and thank you to USD for giving me the opportunity to speak today. And thank you, Nicole. Wow, that is a hard act to follow, but really, really impactful, really meaningful, everything that you said. And what I'm going to be talking about now is really what happens to a certain section of individuals once they reach the US border and actually are inside the United States, and that would be minors. So I work with Casa Cornelia Law Center. We are a nonprofit organization located here in San Diego, and What we do is we screen and represent children who are currently detained in 2 different shelters here in San Diego, California, and one also in Imperial, California. Both shelters are very, very different. They both house minors. Our Imperial shelter houses minors who are tender age, which is to say that they are children under the age of 10 all the way to 0 years old, children who literally were born moments before crossing the border at times. Our El Cajon shelter is a shelter that serves children who are in their adolescence and are typically young boys. And so we serve children in these 2 shelters, and we also serve children who are in the community who happen to find us. And what's really interesting about serving children in the shelters is how much, despite the media attention and how much particularly during the middle of the last influxes, how much they don't fit the scary boogeyman profile that's being made of them. They are not all MS-13 gang members. In fact, very few are. The reality is the children that I meet every day are children just like your children or your nieces or nephews. They are kids. They like to play soccer. They like to talk about girls, and they like to talk about boys, and they like to laugh and talk to you about their movies. They're kids in every way, shape, or form. And I think a lot of the dialogue in the media right now strips them of their childhood and their humanity in that sense. I mean, honestly, we talk about it in academic terms, the children that are coming here, but there is a realistic way to look at it. They're other human beings. And if you could meet them, and if you could interact with them, you would realize how important they are and how they're just like anyone else. And I feel like a lot of the dialogue is stripping them of that humanity. And the tragic thing, as Nicole pointed out, is they are coming here to the United States seeking protection from the United States, often touted by many in the United States as being the freest nation on earth, a nation that stands for some of the loftiest values you can think of. And yet they're finding it very difficult to stay here, to find protection. And to give you sort of a profile of who they are and where they're coming from and what sort of protections they need, the kids that we see most of the time in our shelters are children from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America. And those countries would be Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. We certainly see kids from Haiti. We certainly see kids from Somalia and Mexico and from all over the world. We even have kids from Eastern Europe this past week who are at our shelters. So it's not to say that they only come from these 3 countries, but that's certainly where the trend is. And these kids that we are seeing, my kids, as we refer to them, I mean, when our team refers to them as our kids, you know, our kids are running for their life. No one has there isn't one overlapping motive, and not everyone has just one motive in coming to the United States. But one of the main motives in coming to the United States is escaping these gangs that are running rampant through Central America right now. And this isn't anything new. The first influxes were influenced by the MS-13 and other various gangs in Central America. But the gangs forcibly recruit kids at younger and younger ages. I've had 5-year-olds who are being recruited by gangs. And it is an ultimatum. It is an ultimatum to either join the gang and be involved in hurting other people and selling drugs. And I really want to stress that is one of the greatest fears the kids have in joining the gang isn't necessarily being subject to violence, but being subjected to a situation where they have to hurt other individuals. Just like you and me, they don't want to hurt somebody else. And that's really terrifying to them, is their option is to die or to join a group of people to hurt other people. There are girls who, quite frankly, are being raped into the gangs or being forced to be gang girlfriends. And there are other components that force, or there are other motives that force kids to come here. And I cannot impress upon you enough the amount of child abuse that I learn about from these kids. And that is not to say that Central America is a place where child abuse is something unique. As I work with my colleagues who do guardianships in probate court here in the United States, or my colleagues who work with the family courts, child abuse is everywhere. It is significantly worse in Central America and in other areas of Latin America, because these are areas that are recuperating from years and years and years of civil war, machismo, and I'm sure Ev could go on and on and on and give his own presentation just on what has caused that society to sort of break down in a way that has been catastrophic for kids. And so you find a lot of kids who've been abandoned, who've been abused, and are now seeking refuge here in the United States from that abuse and abandonment and oftentimes neglect. There are other factors. There are family members who live here. There is work. The hurricanes have definitely played a factor in kids not being able to be fed. There are parents who are sending their kids to the United States because they can't feed their kids. I've heard people balk at that and treat it as if it was something that was disgraceful, the idea of this parent sending their kid here. Can you imagine sending your child to the United States because you cannot feed your kid and because there's no way to get food in your child's mouth? Can you imagine sending that child on their own through Mexico, where there are known cartels who kidnap kids on the way, where there are individuals who will rape the kids on the way? This is what we're seeing from the children that we represent. And we are desperately, desperately, desperately trying to get them asylum in the United States. And oftentimes we are running up against a wall because the Attorney General Barr during the last administration put up a lot of barriers to finding asylum if you are victims of domestic violence, if you are escaping gang violence. It has become increasingly difficult to find or to be granted asylum here in the United States, even if you were a child. And it seemed, especially during the last administration, that every time we would find a way around it, we would start working with other forms of relief, special immigrant juvenile status being one of the bigger ones. It's a form of relief when a child can find a safe custodian here in the United States. And they had suffered abuse or neglect, that they could receive a permanent residence. The administration would actively seek out ways to make it more and more difficult, even for special immigrant juvenile status to be granted, or to deport kids while they're waiting for a judge to make a decision, or while the children were waiting for immigration services to grant their visa application. The challenge before the Biden administration is there to reverse a lot of these policies that have hurt the kids that we represent. And I would hope that the Biden administration respects the fact that this is a particular vulnerable population. So the call is out there. The need is still there. Just because there is a new administration, it doesn't mean that everything that's happened before has been undone. And in fact, the current administration is moving, frankly, at a glacial pace to remove the policies that were put in place during the Trump administration. And we as attorneys at places like Casa Cornelia certainly need help. If you go to casacornelia.org, you can help fund attorneys like me and my colleagues. All you have to do is hit that donate button. If you don't have the opportunity to donate, if the funds aren't there, but you have a language ability or any ability, there's a tab there that says volunteer, and you can click and see the different ways that you can volunteer your services to Casa Cornelia. Those are my 2 cents, and I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you all.
Thank you very much, Matt. That's amazing work that you do, and I know it's hard to talk about, and it's hard to summarize because there's so many different pieces to it. Let me introduce now Dulce Garcia, the Executive Director of the Border Angels.
Thank you. I want to echo what my colleagues have said. The programs that we have with Border Angels are programs that have resulted out of a need, a gap. In these programs, some have been running for many years because there has been death in our border region for decades, people crossing the border and many of them dying in that attempt. We have not only created these programs, but also supported families that unfortunately have been suffering from these deaths, folks that have passed away in the detention center last year, crossing through the desert, and even a child that passed away in one of the shelters that we support. I do want to mention that the detention centers are run by private corporations, and therefore there's an incentive to create these spaces and maintain them. There's no disincentive to get people out of these detention centers. With the bond program that we did start last year, we posted our first bond January 7th. And last year we were able to place 69 bonds, reunite 69 people. Over 65 of those bonds were for asylum seekers. So very similarly to what Matt was mentioning, instead of the administration making it easier for us to get people out of the detention center, it became harder. More obstacles were placed, and it became a lot more expensive as well. So we're seeing, especially folks coming from African countries, receive bonds that were exceptionally high. And these are immigration officers, ICE officers on the ground that are making this very arbitrary determination on what bond amount to place on these folks. We consistently ask for policies in writing or some sort of protocol process that they go through to go over and see how is it that they come up with $10,000 bonds, $20,000 bonds. It wasn't a surprise to us when we received a $60,000 bond. It's amazing the cruel and inhumane treatment that the US government has against migrants and asylum seekers. Instead of opening the doors and welcoming them, we put them in a detention center after they have some traveled through 13 different countries to get to our doors to ask for asylum. There's one case where someone was placed in a detention center in the Mexican border for 6 months with immigration detention, arrived at our border and was placed in another 6 months in this facility that is run by a private corporation, making money off of every single night that that person is there. So we have created a system where all of the incentive is there to keep people in detention as punishment for asking for asylum. Thousands of dollars we're asking for people that are fleeing from something horrible that happened to them. They're not arriving out of pleasure or just to find out how fun the US is. They're arriving at our borders because they're fleeing from something horrible, sometimes their own country. We have received people that visibly have scars from the event that they have escaped from. Some with fragments of bullet in their skulls still and in their bodies, and still we put them in detention centers. There was a woman whose child and husband and father was killed in front of her, and we still put her in a detention center and asked for thousands of dollars for her release. Another man who escaped by miracle when they set fire to his house, and family members died in that fire, and he made his way to Brazil through 13 different countries, including the jungle of Panama. That is another way people are dying. And we put him in a detention center and asked for thousands of dollars for his release. Border Angels doesn't receive any government grants. We are supported 100% by the community. So we had community members pulling in money to get this person out. We don't do the work that we do in isolation. We collaborate as much as we can with other organizations. So we received funding from the National Bail Fund Network. We collaborated with the other bond, the San Diego Migrant Rights Consortium bond in town, and the Freedom for Immigrants, and any other bond that we could to try to get these people out. The entire community putting money together to get folks out during a pandemic, when we were hearing horrible stories from inside of the detention center. We would get calls from someone in there. There was a trans woman, I remember clearly. She was horrified and terrified that they didn't get proper PPE in there right as the pandemic was ensuing. She was afraid of the harassment inside of this detention center, where she was in this, what they call pot, with 100 other men, some who had been exhibiting positive signs of COVID-19. And on top of all of that, she was afraid of the harassment and of dying of COVID in this detention center. And then our calls would get cut off because they have to pay for those calls as well, right? Sometimes they get paid less than $1 for the work that they do in the detention center, and then get charged like 80 cents for a call, 80 cents a minute for a call. So it's horrifying. And we can talk all day long about the horrible conditions in these detention centers. And as Nicole is saying, like, what crime have they committed except asking for a chance to survive? And instead we put them in this detention center, ask for thousands of dollars for release. And as Matt was saying, it's happening still today with the Biden administration. We're 100 days into this administration, and on any night, there are over 15,000 people sleeping in this detention center. So the work that we're doing has not changed with the Biden administration. If anything, it's gotten more difficult because of things like Title 42 that we were talking about earlier. In the space at El Chaparral, in my background, has a photo that's now a month old. It is growing. This encampment has now over 2,000 people, over 500 children. You know, we keep hearing the question, what's going on with the children? Well, there are in the streets. There are 500 children sleeping in tents in this space that is not safe for them for the various reasons that my colleagues were talking about. Migrants that are the most vulnerable among us that are in this space, exposed to all kinds of risks, and including medical risks in this space. It is not sanitary. They don't have access to potable water, to food, to nutrition. Pregnant women don't have access to vitamins. They are harassed by other residents, by vendors, by the police, by you name it. We received a woman that arrived from the taxi driver had just robbed her of her last pesos that she had, and she was holding on to her child and holding on to a toddler, and she was shaking, and she couldn't speak Spanish very well because her native language is Zapotec. And the driver knew this and took advantage, knowing that there is the single mom with 2 children not speaking fully Spanish, and therefore less likely to report it to authorities because she would likely be ignored. And so they run higher risks in these spaces. So when in the U.S. side, you know, we hear questions about what's happening to the children, more attention needs to be diverted to our southern border, because we are seeing children in the shelters that are at max capacity without the ability to socially distance in these spaces. And as Nicole was explaining, the government's expelling people, using resources to hold them in Texas, fly them over to San Diego. Those are resources that could be used instead to provide testing and processing of these people, and instead are expelling them by the hundreds into these shelters that are already on max capacity without any funding from either government, either the US or the Mexican government, depending wholeheartedly on the community to provide even basic things like water and gas and food. So it's horrifying that 100 days into this administration, it's still happening. Trump might have started using the provisions under Title 42, but the Biden administration is still using them today. The end date, the latest one that has been provided has been May 21st, but this, I mean, if it gets extended, I wouldn't be surprised. And asylum has not been fully restored, as Matt was saying. So I have hope. I'm holding on to hope, but the reality is that here on the ground in Tijuana, things are, I mean, to say that they're difficult is an understatement. And the water drop directors on the ground are still seeing signs of families crossing through the desert, little kids' backpacks and shoes, women hygiene products and underwear to show that it's not just the single male, as you were talking about, Ev. The need is still there, and we're going to keep seeing these deaths along our southern border unless we change the framework that we work under. Instead of having a militarized enforcement type of framework, we should have one based on humanitarian aid, on humanitarian principles, and changing the way that we talk about and approach migrants. Comprehensive immigration reform has been long overdue. I've been in the US undocumented for 33 years. No one should be undocumented for 33 years with still no path to citizenship and really no hope at this point, seeing the conversations that are occurring in Washington, D.C., which is very disheartening. And you know, I do want to leave with the positive note with the Green Card for Kids program that we started last year as well, providing legal representation, because as we know, the U.S. does not consider the right to an attorney for immigration purposes yet something that is provided for our migrant community. So we identified a gap for one of the counties that doesn't have an immigration attorney for these kids that are in the custody of the state. And we were able to stop the deportation of a 10-year-old and obtain her green card. So we have those small wins that we like to hold on to. But, you know, the idea is that Matt was explaining that the US government actively works to deport children that have been abused or abandoned and neglected and are already in our community. It's mind-boggling to us, but here we are, and still happening with this Biden administration. So this administration has a lot of work ahead of it, but I think we need to see more action and more promises filled from the campaign, because ultimately these folks that are in Tijuana is what they heard, right? They heard these promises by the Biden administration during the campaign and are here asking the government to be true to those promises. And as my colleagues mentioned, we should keep pushing. Unfortunately, it's exhausting to have to push. We're going to have to do this work of pushing this administration. I thought I was going to have my first vacation with this Biden administration. Has not happened. On the contrary, I am so exhausted from seeing what I'm seeing in Tijuana right now as a direct result of the failed action or lack of action from this administration. I could keep talking all day about the different programs, but I encourage you to visit our website on www.borderangels.org. Very similar to the other organizations, we can use your help in anything. We haven't done really fundraisers. We didn't do any fundraising last year. The community did all of that for us. People selling pencils and yoga classes and DJ sessions and designing t-shirts. There was a paletero that did an abolish ICE t-shirt and selling that, and that's how we paid for bonds. And so anything, any skill that you have, we can go ahead and put to use. And just another big thank you to all of these organizations that are doing such great work. All of the panelists here, very inspirational, and it lets us keep doing the work that we do, because we know we're not doing it alone, and there is a big community out there that is doing the best we can given the horrible circumstances we find ourselves right now in.
Thank you very much, Dulce. That was really powerful, and I just want everybody keep thinking about that. Think about the U.S. government charging Black migrants more for bond than other migrants. Just like start there, and it gives you just an indication of some of the social and cultural stuff that's behind a lot of these policies. I'd like to turn it over now to our final panelist from here at USD, Maria Silva, the Director of Community Partnerships at the Mulvaney Center. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Nicole, Matthew, Dulce, for all the work that you do and everything that you shared. I want to stress Dulce's point that Al Otro Lado, Casa Cornelia, and Border Angels USD are not working in silos. I think that's one of the great assets of our region, is that we work in coordination and in collaboration with each other. So I want to speak a little bit to the California Welcoming Task Force, which we've been a part of since, I guess, early this year. The California Welcoming Task Force is a binational coalition of more than 65 organizations on both sides of the California-Mexico border region that supports the processing of asylum seekers from the border to their final destination with respect and dignity into safety and freedom in the US. We coordinate efforts in 5 areas: humanitarian, legal, health, advocacy, and communications. USD has been sitting on the Humanitarian Assistance Subcommittee of the California Welcoming Task Force since its inception. And so we've had the honor and privilege of working alongside our community partner organizations here and across the border, and really listening to the needs that are out there, and finding ways for the university to support these. My hat and our hats go off to UCSD, who also sits on this task force and who has really taken over many of the health services for asylum seekers currently arriving in the region. And I think it goes to show, both of our presence in the task force goes to show that there's an important space for universities to occupy in this conversation. There's lots of resources, human, financial, social capital that universities hold that can and should be shared with our community partners. As a university that is committed to addressing urgent challenges, USD has the commitment and the responsibility to help respond to these needs. So as part of our role in the Humanitarian Assistance Committee, we have been working closely with the IRC and other partner organizations on both sides of the border, but in San Diego in particular, with the IRC supporting families who do not have a sponsor in the US and who are staying long-term in San Diego. So what we are assisting with is mental health resources. Matthew, Dulce, Nicole, all of you alluded to the humanity of immigrants being stripped as they go through this process. And I think a lot of you talked about the journey of getting to the border and the horrifying nightmare that is to cross the border. And for those who are able to cross the border, getting to the US is oftentimes just the start of another very challenging journey, right? To be able to make it here and to then have to find a way to make ends meet, a way to reach your final destination, a way to access health services, a way to deal with the trauma that was inflicted throughout the journey. So accessing mental health services is something that we've seen is a huge need, and that's one of the ways that we're supporting. We're helping with ESL classes, spiritual accompaniment for folks that the IRC is working with, as well as food services. Our School of Nursing is assisting with vaccination campaigns for IRC clients as well. And so really this piece is a call to action to stress what our colleagues have already said about opportunities to get involved with this work. If you're a USD student, faculty, alumni, and you are interested in being in the front lines, being a part of this work, whether that's through, there's opportunities to do this work remotely or in person as well. There's a lot of needs now in both Tijuana and San Diego to provide in-person support. So if you are fully vaccinated and comfortable with assisting in person, there's ways we can get you plugged in. If you want to do this work remotely, there's also ways we can get you plugged in to any of the partner organizations here on the panel, but also to the broader coalition of organizations that are part of the California Welcoming Task Force. I'm happy to be a contact person for anyone who wants to get involved, both if you're related to USD and if you're not affiliated with USD, I'm happy to help point you in the right way as well. We have funding for summer internships for any of our USD undergraduate students. We have a longer summer fellowship program where we're funding students to volunteer at organizations full-time for 2 months during the summer. Some of them are placed in organizations that are part of the California Welcoming Task Force, both in Tijuana and in San Diego. If you're an undergrad at USD, we also place work study students at these partner organizations throughout the academic year. And if you are not looking for an internship or work study or formal assistantship, we can also plug you in through just co-curricular volunteer opportunities. In terms of our work in Tijuana, I did want to highlight one of the creative projects that we're working in collaboration with one of the migrant shelters in Tijuana and the School of Engineering. We're working on a project that transforms recyclable waste into goods that can be sold. So the bigger purpose is to provide a micro enterprise and a source of income for folks in this migrant shelter using recyclable waste as a means to produce small goods that will be sold. So there's room for lots of creativity for folks, as Dulce was saying, with any skill set. If you have business skills that you can help provide, if you have design, graphics skills, writing skills, research skills, engineering skills, I think there's a place for folks from all backgrounds to get involved to help address some of the challenges. I will mention that we have an initiative to establish a physical USD space in Tijuana, what we're calling our Tijuana Hub. This is a project that was envisioned a couple of years ago and has been delayed because of the pandemic, but we hope to inaugurate this Tijuana Hub space as soon as the pandemic allows, and it will be a space that is available for our partners to work out of in Tijuana, but also for our students and faculty to use as classroom space, to use as design brainstorming space as we do this work in partnership with organizations in Tijuana. So lots of potential, again, for universities to be part of this conversation and to think big and outside the box about how we can help channel some of the resources that we have, and a call to action for our USD and off-campus community to support us. And again, happy to help plug you.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was great, and I want to stress too. I want to thank you personally. I mean, I think it's one thing for some people in a university to get together, but I want to stress this is a big coordinated effort that Maria has made. Really turned from her own personal patience and participating on some boards to being part of a big collaborative regional effort that really for the students out there, I just want to say that there's every level you can get involved here, and it's really thanks to her work. So thank you so much, and thank all of you. I mean, really, these are really terrific, and I have to say heartrending. It's hard to talk about this stuff, and I just want to say personally, I really appreciate it. We all work in different spheres, and I've been mostly in the immigration courts this year as an expert witness, and so it's a really different thing having being in immigration court. And it is something I want to mention. You guys all have experience with this too. Imagine those who get the chance to tell their story, having to tell that story in a box in a detention center, a cement box on a camera like this. It's something to see until you've experienced it. Somebody who's in tears and basically begging a judge to let them stay, and they're having to communicate this way. It's really, and that's those are folks who've moved further along this process than many. So thank you all for your work. And what I'd like to do now is open up to some questions. I'm just gonna, I want to ask, the first one I think let me direct to Maria. The first two, actually, if you could talk about folks who want to donate meals. If you know anything about that, Maria, I think that would be great. And Nicole, if you have insights about that too, any of the rest of you, please don't hesitate to just put your hand up and we'll cut you in. And also, are there the orgs that are providing mental health services? You all mentioned those. Maybe we could ask to just sort of run through the group. We'll ask Maria to go first, and then we'll kind of run through the group, because I think all of you mentioned different aspects of that, and I think it'd be a good thing to underscore. So Maria, if you talk about food donations and then about some mental health services, and then I'll invite the colleagues each to talk about the mental health services that come up as part of their work.
Sure. In terms of meals, I know that Safe Harbors Network will take, it depends on whether you're thinking about prepared meals or perishable goods, but you might want to check out Safe Harbors Network. And I know that they will take certain types of food donations. And the other question was around mental health services. Survivors of Torture is doing great work in terms of mental health provision in San Diego. You can look them up and see if there's volunteer opportunities there. I'm not sure about their volunteer opportunities, but they are taking a big chunk of this work. And then USD, as I mentioned, through our School of Counseling, is also providing mental health support with both the IRC and Jewish Family Services. I don't know if, Dulce, it looked like you had your hand up. I don't know if you have more to share there.
Yes, we are hoping more people are able to bring meals across to Tijuana or prepare them here in Tijuana, and in particular for the encampment. Feeding 2,000 people, 500 children every single day, 3 meals. It's a challenge. There are organizations and church groups that come every day to provide food, but they can always use more. So if you have been vaccinated and you're able to drive through, we would really appreciate that. And the mental health aspect, the Psicólogos Sin Fronteras, the psychologists that have been going to the encampment every Saturday, have been collaborating with us to do the legal clinics. So first they talk to the psychologist and tell them their story, and then they talk to us, the lawyers, because it's very challenging to hear them. And sometimes they want to be heard and they want to tell you the entire story. And so I always feel guilt because I feel like I re-traumatize them. They don't teach you in law school these mental health aspects on getting the story from the client and dealing with that. And so we have them see the psychologist first, have a consultation with them, and then they see us. So we can definitely use more help, because there's only 2 psychologists and 2 lawyers on the ground here that we're doing this. And so we can certainly use more. And then in the shelters, there's also a great need for it. And I know Refugee Health Alliance has been doing such a great job in the shelters as well, and they could also use volunteers.
Nicole, do you want to take a little bit of that one too? I know it's increasing part of what Al Otro Lado does.
Yeah, part of our intake process, we're looking at people's medical and mental health vulnerabilities, as well as experiences of abuse with Mexican authorities. And so we frequently make referrals to Families Belong Together. They have a psychologist that does counseling via telephone, but I do know that program is really strapped. There's such a great need for mental health counseling, and there's just not enough therapists or licensed social workers to fill that gap. And also, it's even if you had enough, it's kind of like immigrants are involved in an incredibly toxic, abusive relationship with the US legal system. We see the same gaslighting of immigrants and their advocates that we would see in a domestic violence situation. And it's really hard to throw mental health services at a problem that is being created by the US government. The torture that's happening, the danger that people are in is being created by us. And so to have someone talk about their feelings about the torture that we're putting them through, I mean, that's just a difficult position to be in.
Yeah, that it's certainly.
Oh.
I feel that like the idea like of ongoing trauma, you know, like it's not over, and that's part of the lack of finality there. Let me give Matt a chance to talk about the special mental health needs of kids and what's available and maybe what the shortfalls are.
It's a tough one because there's not much that's available, particularly to kids who don't already have permanent residence in the United States, or at least asylum. We do have through our organization, we have a coordinator who we refer our children to, and she actively looks throughout the community for separate, like different organizations that would service their particular needs. There's a lot of services available through schools. There are services available for the Center for Community Solutions here locally in San Diego. And I think we rely on them quite a bit. But yeah, La Maestra has also been very helpful as far as the medical front is concerned. For kids who are detained, they are offered mental health services while they're in the Office of Refugee Resettlement shelter. And when I say the Office of Refugee Resettlement shelter, I am talking about the ones that have been established before the most recent influx, and not the emergency reception centers, such as the one here at the Convention Center. My understanding is the Convention Center is a little bit chaotic. I know South Bay Community Center or something. I can't remember their full name, but they're doing their best to receive the kids, but there's just a massive amount of kids down there. But the kids who are at the shelters they do have quality doctors. They do have quality medical health care and mental health care provided to them. There was an issue with their counseling services during the last, say, 2 to 3 years, where we found out that the notes of the mental health care providers, because they were operating through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, were sometimes being distributed to government counsel in removal proceedings. So if a kid was to mention something such as, involvement with a gang, government counsel during removal proceedings would bring these notes that the child thought were confidential, would bring that out in the middle of removal proceedings to be used against the child. Much to the horror of the mental health care providers. They were not aware that this was going on. And you hear about mental health care providers in these shelters now keeping their own notebooks out of fear that the Office of Refugee Resettlement is going to give that to the United States government. So it's fraught with problems, but as soon as they're released, we certainly do the best we can to actively look out in the community and see what mental health services and medical services are best tailored to each individual kid.
Maria, could you pivot off that and talk a little bit about the Convention Center? You're really our best source, I think, for understanding what's going on here in San Diego.
I will defer on the Convention Center. We haven't gotten involved there, and I'm not sure if anyone can speak to that, but I was going to add another layer of complication to the mental health conversation is that this population is in constant movement. And so when we start providing mental health services to someone who may or may not stay in San Diego or in Tijuana or wherever we are, ethical concerns have been brought up on, is it what's best, just to start this conversation and then kind of leave it without continued treatment, or to work only with clients that are going to be here longer term and can receive the appropriate and continued sustained care. So that's been another issue that has complicated the provision of mental health services. In terms of the convention center, I'll defer. I don't know if any other my colleagues know more.
Yeah, I don't know. Dulce, have you been to the convention center? Do you know anybody who's working there?
We have our tour is scheduled for the 13th. But I will say that some of us here know what the alternative is, right? And that is for Border Patrol to have custody of these children or have them in their facilities. I am glad that it's our community partners, our own friends that are in that space providing support as much as they can, and they can use more. But it's our friends and community members and community partners that are in charge of that facility right now in collaboration with the federal government. So as opposed to having them in horrible conditions where Border Patrol does not have the mental health training or the humanitarian principles that we were talking about when they have these children in their custody. That's the alternative that some of us have seen and witnessed. And so I know there's a lot that we had some other partners that were organizing to protest that convention center and the Long Beach one. But we have seen the alternatives. And so we'd rather have community partners doing that work than the Border Patrol.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, you know, when you're looking at policy and the decision of the city of San Diego to do this, I think you have to say that it was the right decision, but the only decision. And, you know, we can make a qualitative assessment when we get, you know, evidence, but compared to the hileras and the, you know, what happens in law enforcement custody, I think there's no question. There's a couple of questions. I got a couple via Facebook and there's in the chat here about asylum. And let me just sort of summarize the question. And I'll ask maybe Nicole to start and any of the rest of you who want to weigh in as well. But it's just the question about I'd say the first part of the question is like the gap between what people coming to the border seeking asylum think they know about asylum and then what the legal standard actually is, like what it actually takes to get asylum. And this is over and above the limits and really the assault on asylum by the Trump administration. Would any of you like to address that? Just sort of like, what do people, is there a gap between what people think asylum means and what the actual process entails, and how do you address that as lawyers? Nicole, would you start with that one?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge gap in what people understand asylum to be and then what it actually is in practice in the US system. And what people assume it to be is a form of international protection for people who fear living in their home country, either for persecution or for other reasons that they're not able to live safely. And I mean, ideally, that's what asylum should be about. However, asylum in the US system is, you need to suffer persecution by particular parties for particular reasons. And the idea that someone has to suffer in a measurable amount and we need to get to the certain measurement of suffering for these very specific reasons and in order for their lives to be deemed worthy of protecting is just frankly obnoxious. It's gross. It's disgusting. The fact that goods can move freely around the world, but people cannot is just an abomination of modern time, and particularly when the people that are coming from Central America and Mexico in particular are coming from conditions that our foreign policy helped create. The Biden administration has been doing a lot of talking about addressing push factors. A great push factor that they might address is just closing down the School of the Americas, which is based in Fort Benning in Georgia and produces some of the worst human rights violators in the last 70 years that have gone on to cause mass crisis in Latin America. So I'm just veering off of topic, but the idea that people have is that they can get protection in the United States, and that's just not how our system has functioned. It functions as a deportation system.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, I think the biggest thing I see is just that people don't understand that it's individual persecution. It's not actually, underlying country conditions. You have to show you've individually been targeted for persecution based on one of the protected grounds. Matt, do you want to add something about, like how children perceive this, which I know opens a whole nother.
many children don't even know that asylum even exists, that it's a thing. If you keep in mind, a lot of the kids that come here are kind of like deer in the headlights, and they've been encouraged to come here by well-meaning relatives on the other end, especially the younger ones. So they have no idea what's happening to them. So the idea that they now have to go to immigration court, and that there's this thing called asylum, and that they have to navigate that without an attorney being appointed to them is mind-blowing. And it's crippling to them because, as has been mentioned before, you're not provided with your own attorney when you go to immigration court. And a lot of the kids that we see at the shelter are not staying here in San Diego. They're not staying at the shelter for a very long time. They're about to go someplace else with the sponsor who might also be undocumented, who also has, very little understanding of US immigration law. And you have to explain to the kid, okay, this is what I understand about your case. This is how complicated it is. And you really need to find a lawyer when you get to your new destination. And forget trying to manage asylum in an immigration court. That to them is so daunting, like on their own. It's impossible. Even finding an attorney, going to that next step, they're terrified of trying to find an attorney. So they honestly have no idea from a child's perspective what they're getting into and the burden that's placed on them as a mere child. And then for my older kids, yeah, when they get here, I think it's the same idea. The feeling is that it's individual persecution, not they have to belong to a particular social group or class of individuals who are being persecuted on whole by say their government or someone their government can't protect. That's just way above their heads.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the other thing for folks who've never been around people in this situation, is just what people decide to say to whom and when. I mean, I don't know how many people, what percentage of asylum cases are just end up the main line of defense often for the government in prosecuting the cases is discrepancy between what someone said at a border interview and what they say in subsequent testimony. It's just like one of the most basic things about the way proceedings happen. But then you guys know from experience too that what someone says in an intake interview, with someone that they've never met before, they may not mention a sexual assault to a stranger that they've known for 10 minutes, or they may not mention, all of these things that stories that might come tumbling out when you build some trust with someone and they finally come to understand that they have actually an interest in presenting themselves that way. But it's not obvious to people, and they don't have any real good reason to trust in that. And that trust is the center of whether that story will ever come out. We have a bunch of questions here about Title 42, and then there's some more specific legal questions I think we can get into. Dulce or Nicole, would you like to talk a little bit? Nicole kind of introduced it. I wonder if one of you guys would take that. The question was, is it being misused, or is it just should it never been there in the first place? Could you talk about that for a bit?
Our good friends from ACLU are actually litigating this issue. I'm really thankful to them for doing that work. I will add on to what you were saying though, before. Sometimes the clients don't necessarily know how to articulate their claims, but there is a question about whether knowing that there's a right to asylum for everyone, whether that drives people to the border. Some of the people that we talk to, they say, I just want to work. I just want to go to the US to work. But really, they have had so many horrific things happening to them. What they're saying is, I want a chance to live, and I want a life. I want to survive. They just don't know what words to use to articulate a claim that might be defendable or winnable in court. And so I think the folks that, at least the ones that we have talked to in El Chaparral, so far, all of them are fleeing from horrible violence, and they are looking to survive. And so whether somebody tells you have a right to asylum or not, they know that they're there. hoping to survive. And it's not really because the NGOs are saying that everyone has a right to claim asylum. So I want to clarify that. As far as Title 42 and the more technical issues, I'll leave it to Nicole. And then if anybody has any questions on the impact that it's having on our border towns, I can talk more about that. But I will say that that's one of the reasons why the 17 shelters in Tijuana that we support are at max capacities, because the U.S. government continues to expel daily hundreds of people to these spaces without any PPE, COVID-19 testing. You know, they put them on a plane and from Texas to San Diego, expel them, and then that's that, without zero regard to their well-being or how it would have an impact on the border towns like Tijuana. But on the more technical issues, I don't know if Nicole wants to add anything on it.
I would start from the basic premise that Title 42 should not exist at all, because it's based on a flawed premise that it keeps the US government, or US citizens rather, safer from COVID spread in Mexico. This would maybe be true if we didn't allow US citizens and legal permanent residents to go to Mexico and vacation in Rosarito or get drunk on Revolucion and then come back with zero health screening. So there is no rhyme or reason that we need to keep these asylum seekers who are trying their best to quarantine in shelters and wear masks from coming in and being processed to save their lives. But a bunch of spring breakers can go to Rosarito and get wasted at Papa's and beer. It's kind of offensive and racist. But aside from the moral outrage that we should all feel, it violates the Convention Against Torture, because we are expelling people to territories in which they fear torture, both in Mexico and also in their countries of origin. And we conducted, or we continue to conduct this survey. It's how we triage the most vulnerable cases. But so far, we've had over 2,000 migrants respond to our survey. And I believe that 2 out of every 5 that have been expelled have experienced a very significant form of violence, including kidnapping, being forced into trafficking, being sexually assaulted, being nearly murdered. And that's a result of being expelled under Title 42. In Reynosa, when they were still doing the expulsions there, as soon as people were released from CBP custody and walked across the bridge, they were being kidnapped. And so, you know, the United States as a general public and the government, we like to talk about the corruption of Mexico and the narco gobierno, and the government of Mexico is in bed with the narcos. It's no different when CBP officers and DHS know that as soon as that migrant leaves the door, they're going to be kidnapped by a cartel and potentially disappeared, at worst, at best, maybe just extorted. Their families will have to pay money to get them released. So the narco gobierno extends from Mexico into the US. And so this whole policy not only violates our moral code as a nation and what we said that we were when we sat down with the other nations after the Holocaust and said, never again, let's come up with asylum law, but it also violates the treaties that we have ratified and said that we are going to abide by.
Did you, Nicole, let me keep you on and ask if you could, do you have a response to this question in chat about the notice to appears, that judges are rendering them defective and terminating cases without prejudice based on CBP's neglect to check the right box?
Yeah, I can respond to that, but I also just saw in the chat there was something about the newborns being adopted out. There might be some confusion. These newborns are being expelled with their mothers to Mexico without a birth certificate. So they're not being adopted out, they're being expelled and they're being made stateless by the United States government. And that means they can't access healthcare because they can't prove where they were born. And that means they can't access those really critical early childhood vaccines that can mean the difference between a child making it to their first or their second birthday or dying within the first 6 months. And regard to judges rendering NTAs defective and terminating cases without prejudice, I'm not sure if that is in reference to a lot of the cases that were in the MPP program where judges terminated the cases for defects in the NTAs. That definitely did happen a lot, particularly with Judge O'Connor. And what's fascinating about these terminations and Judge O'Connor is that the migrants were given no opportunity to respond or seek legal counsel to respond to the inclination of the court to terminate. And that's not acceptable. When the court's taking an action, both parties should have the right to respond. But the immigration court, and particularly Judge O'Connor, they could do whatever they want because these are just migrants. They don't have anybody to represent them since there's no right to pay to low cost or pro bono representation as a migrant. You have a right to an attorney, but it's a meaningless right because you can't afford an attorney. And so that's how the system has been allowed to function. And it's very reflective of the institutional racism and the racism of our immigration bench.
Well, so thanks. No, and I think that's it's stunning, and I mean, especially when you think about the number of people in proceedings who are not even represented by counsel. So the issue, I mean, it's like they're legally disappeared. I think we've handled most of the questions here from the public, but I want to ask you one last one because I feel like it's an important issue that comes up, and there are a lot of presumptions about it, many of which I suspect are false. But I want to ask you guys, whoever would like to take it, just throw a hand up and we'll give everybody a chance to weigh in. But there's a really strong confirmation bias out there about the idea that somehow the Biden administration changed immigration policy or created the specter that immigration policy would be changed, and that has something to do with the large numbers of people at the border. I've seen it in almost every paper in the United States that's covered this, and it's almost unquestioned. And I have strong doubts about it, but I'd like to hear from you guys. Like, that are people are there because they thought it was going to be different under this presidential administration, and that's one of the reasons they're there. How would you respond to that? Anybody want to weigh in?
I can weigh in. Under the MPP program alone, we placed approximately 70,000 people in this remain in Mexico policy. Many of them who have been waiting there for over 2 years, in many cases over 1 year. The processing of asylum seekers has not been moving for now 1 year. So that's a complete backlog of people that have arrived during the pandemic that are just waiting for their turn, along with the 70-something thousand people in MPP who have been waiting years for their turn. When processing stopped for asylum seekers, there were approximately 10,000 people on the wait list in Tijuana alone. And so that's not to say that people aren't necessarily migrating with the hope that the Biden administration will give them more of a fair shake and an opportunity to save their lives than the Trump administration. But what people forget is that there were hundreds of thousands of people waiting here and kept here by the Trump administration. And only now they're a bit more visible. And part of that visibility also has to do with conservative biases in the media and the narrative that certain conservative power players want to put out there. And you know what, even if more people were, like this is the worst case scenario, more people are coming because they think Biden is going to give them an opportunity. So what? Like, literally, so what? Like, Americans can't afford that extra television or that second car, or, for their 2-car garage. People are fleeing to the country that in many respects destabilized their homeland. And we have a responsibility to fix the mess that we clean up and not complain so much about it, because there's more than enough room at our table. And we have more than enough lumber in the United States to build a bigger table if people feel a little crowded.
That's great. Anybody else like to weigh in on the policy question? Because I think we're just about at time, so we'll close pretty quick.
Everything Nicole said, and I think some are just so desperate, and that's why they're crossing through the desert, through the mountain, through the oceans, and dying, right? I think they have hope that the Biden administration will come to its senses, but they have been waiting some for 2 years in these shelters, in these spaces. Some have been suffered through so much as they've been waiting. Some of the people that we talked to at El Chaparral are coming within the interior of Mexico and have been waiting this entire time. Some from Tapachula, from other spaces where they were then suffering extortion, kidnapping, rape. One woman in Mexico was raped and is pregnant, and another one was raped and has her newborn with her. As she waited in Mexico, this happened to her. So she's not in our border because she believes in the Biden administration. She's on our border because she's desperate. And whether it was Trump or Biden or whomever as president, they would have been here again, knocking on our doors, except now the pandemic is, at least in the US side, it's supposed to be, better. And so there's hope that the doors will one day open to asylum, or at least that asylum will be considered essential. One of the biggest disappointments that I have in my own country now that I am with advanced parole through DACA in Tijuana is I haven't gone to freaking Valle de Guadalupe, and I see all of these pictures from white people in these spaces, enjoying the ocean view, enjoying the best of service and security, while these other Mexicans are in this space in Chaparral, facing gangs, facing the own government, the own local police, the cartels, and even the local residents here. When they're in their own country and don't have even 10 pesos or whatever to enjoy playas, or have a bathroom, or have water. And in the meantime, as Nicole was saying, we have Americans coming into this space enjoying it. So I do want to invite those that do have that privilege to come into the space and provide food, provide toiletries, provide basic things, because we think that bringing in white skin color into the space is going to make the space somewhat safer. It's how Mexico works right now, and it's the biggest disappointment that I have, being in my own country and seeing now firsthand how unfair the government is to its own residents.
Thank you very much, Dulce, and I want to thank you all for sharing today. This is powerful stuff, and I hope you've inspired our audience to get involved and not just be passive consumers of this stuff, but get out there and do something. So let me just thank Nicole Ramos, the director of the Border Rights Project at El Otro Lado, Matthew Cannon, the director of the Children's Program at Casa Cornelia Law Center, Dulce Garcia, the executive director of the Border Angels, and Maria Silva, the director of community partnerships at the Mulvaney Center. Thank you guys for your time today. Thank you for your work. For those who've asked, we will put their names and organizations. We'll put them up on our Facebook page, and we'll get them into the YouTube comments too. So no excuse not to reach out and find these folks and contribute to the cause. It really is one cause. So thank you to everyone in the public who joined us today. Thanks for your questions. You've helped to make this first of our Kroc Border Behind the Headlines, I think, a great success. We've got our work cut out for us, but it's really heartening to see this community. So thank you all very much, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Hasta luego.
Thank you, everyone. I really